All right, cool. Well, then let's just get started. So hello, everyone. I'm Lulu, and I'm one of the co-editors for this special double issue of EBR, which is the Electronic Book Review and the Digital Review. And I am currently a senior at the University of Waterloo studying systems design engineering. And another interviewer with me today is Jinsol. Jinsol, if you'd like to introduce yourself as well.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Jinsol. I'm also a co-editor on the special issue of TDR and EBR, Critical Making, Critical Design. I'm currently going into my 5th year of the PhD at the University of Waterloo, and I'm in the Department of English, and I am studying the cross-sections of critical race theory and digital photography.
Cool. Thank you, Jinsol. So let's start off with a land acknowledgement. So based in Canada, the Electronic Book Review would like to acknowledge that this land is made up of more than 630 First Nations communities, representing more than 50 nations and 50 Indigenous languages. So yeah, this interview is a part of a new EBR interview series called Conversations that was inaugurated in 2020. In the series, we speak to scholars and practitioners who are engaged in digital storytelling, electronic literature, and the digital arts, amongst other topics. As a part of this new series, you are the first group we are speaking to. So as for everyone who is watching, we are joined here with 7 members of the Decameron 2.0, a group of 9 women scholars and artists here in Canada who have spent the last 12 months working on creative work such as poetry, prose, art, digital art, and anything of the like during and in response to COVID-19. They're inspired by the classical work of literature, the Decameron, about 10 people who leave Rome during the Black Plague for safety and who gather to tell stories. So welcome, Decameron 2.0.
Thanks for having us. Glad to be here.
Thank you.
So I guess before we get started with our interview questions, I was wondering if you could go around kind of introducing yourselves with your names, preferred pronouns, maybe 2 or 3 sentences about you and your practice, and just as a little fun thing, just a verb that kind of describes your day today. Let's start with Lychee.
All right. Hello, I'm Lychee Fan. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Waterloo in Canada. I'm also the editor of one of the editors of Electronic Book Review and the Digital Review. And a few sentences about my practice. I often practice at the intersection of theory and practice, or my work is at the intersection of theory and practice. And I often think about questions of systemic bias in technological design. I think a lot about digital storytelling and interactive storytelling. And so primarily I would describe my work as interdisciplinary. A verb to describe my day, a verb specifically or a word?
A verb.
A verb. Rushed. No, rushing. No. Whoa, rushing. There we go.
I'll go next. I'm Caitlin Fisher. I'm a professor at York University in Toronto, where I direct the Immersive Storytelling Lab. I'm also the vice president of the Electronic Literature Organization. And a verb to describe my day, lifting.
I can go next. I'm Monique Chofin. I'm at Ryerson University, which we are currently calling X University in solidarity with our Indigenous colleagues. I work in the area of visual culture, and basically my research all revolves around a question of whether an artwork can be an act of theory. I think it can. And the verb of the day, I think, is dreaming.
Okay, I can go next. I'm Jolene Armstrong. I'm an associate professor at Athabasca University in comparative literature. I guess my main work in terms of what's relevant here is that I'm a multimedia artist, and although not necessarily digital. And a verb to describe my day, I can think of lots of adjectives. float. I'm floating day. It's a floating day.
All right, I can go. My name is Kari Morin. I am a contract lecturer at X University, the university formerly known as Ryerson. I have no words. My words are gone. My area of expertise doesn't really matter because I'm a contract lecturer, but I do medieval stuff. So I guess this is appropriate. I'm also an author, a musician, and a cartoonist, which is probably more relevant to what we're doing. And a verb to describe my day would be glare, I guess. I'm a bit grumpy.
Hey, I'm Isabella Priska Oldenhoff. I'm an associate professor at also the X University. I'm a filmmaker and I work both with analog obsolete technologies and digital technologies, including working with some AI for the Decameron project, part of this collective. I don't know what else to say except for a verb that describes my day: reading. That's what I started doing first thing this morning.
And lastly, I believe we have Angela on the phone as well.
Yes, hello. I'm Angela Yosa, and I work mainly in experimental film, both analog and digital, with some installation work as well. And sorry for some background noise here. And soon to be moving from, I did my PhD in the joint program in communication and culture, York and Ryerson, but I'm going to start a library science degree at U of T starting this fall.
And we have two people who are missing today, and I would introduce them anyways. Siobhan O'Flynn teaches at the University of Toronto, and Kelly Egan is at Trent University.
All right, thank you so much. So I guess we'll get started with our first question, and that would be, what motivated or inspired the new Decameron Collective project, and what would you say are its main objectives?
I think Monique inspired it, so Monique should go first, and then we should add.
Okay, well, I won't say inspired so much as craved. We were turning a page in history and going into lockdown, and it felt like a fairly alienating space. So I think I had this post on Facebook, and I asked if anybody would want to join the Decameron 2.0. And to my great surprise, everybody here jumped into the project. And it was something that we really found its shape as we began to meet, first over cocktails and yakking, and then began to write together. And we've been doing this weekly, I think without exception, since basically March 2020.
As part of that, I would say, I mean, this is something that was a part of Lulu and Jinsel's introduction, that we were inspired by the original, like Boccaccio's Decameron, the story that people who were isolated and fleeing, another verb, flee, came together and sought the opportunity to develop a new community, band together, inspire each other, tell stories. Some fun stories, some naughty stories, but they found, I guess, companionship in isolation. And I think that has driven the spirit of this project, which didn't start out as a project, as Monique mentioned.
Yeah, I love the idea both of the community and also the structure. So it actually really did appeal to me to have like the regularity of the weekly meeting, and also having sort of the intertext of Decameron as a form. I like the idea of regular storytelling and storytelling as sort of a practice to help to understand moments in our lives. So it seemed super apt. And I was really curious to see what kind of stories might come out of this time. So exciting.
We did actually start off with the intent to read the Decameron, and that didn't entirely pan out, but I think one of the things that did was that we all did read the introduction to it, the sort of the frame narrative in which these people are gathering to tell the stories. And Boccaccio was he was drawing on he was basically taking this description of the plague from many other plagues. Like he took older descriptions of the plague and he bunged them into his description of the plague. But it's kind of convincing when you read it, and it sounds like what's happening now. I mean, he's talking about some people just decided that they would party, and some people shut themselves in their houses and they never went outside. And so it was what we were going through, and I think that actually helped, even if we didn't do exactly what Boccaccio was doing.
Yeah. I read it. I thought, and it was kind of crazy because it was filled with the morality tales, but I actually thought that it was, reading it as kind of like didactic text to help to understand plague. So I might have read it all, but I actually had it on Audible. So I got a lot of those stories.
Many of them involve monks doing bad things.
I guess the one thing I would like to also point out, it's just also wonderful to be surrounded by all these great women, and I look forward to that also weekly. During the pandemic, it's been very difficult to kind of continue and be social. So this is not only, this is very stimulating intellectually, creatively, but also emotionally. So it's just been nice to bond this way. Another thing I would say is that after each session, at the end of each session, we share the works we produce. And it's been interesting to see the correspondences between some of the works. And also, I must say, I've been inspired by many of them. So, yeah.
That's very cool. So it sounds like with the collective and Decameron 2.0, as you're calling yourselves, a lot of it is about companionship / community building and like creativity and stuff like that. So I see a lot of overlaps, maybe given the context with the original Boccaccio's Decameron. So I'm wondering now, what are some of the key differences that you see between Decameron 1.0, I guess, like Boccaccio's Decameron and Decameron 2.0?
Fewer monks.
So many fewer monks. So one of the things I would start with is, in fact, the similarity. So obviously the scenario in which we have found ourselves retreated from the world of plagues and are telling stories to each other is similar. And the form is as well. So the original Decameron is part of a genre of narrative called the frame narratives, and 1001 Nights is an example. Marguerite de Navarre's Heptameron is another. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is another. These are stories that work really well and very compelling because they're all about the persistence of story against death. So thematically, they really resonate with what it is we're doing and where we find ourselves. But they're also really great ways of catching heterogeneous stories in one envelope. And so in the original Decamerons, there are really naughty stories, there are really mean stories, there are stories that are fables. the genres really switch. And although each day in the Decameron has a theme, the kinds of materials that are accumulated there are very different one from another. And so that made it really appropriate for our forms of storytelling, because we've really had people contribute in all sorts of genres. I think you gave a bit of a survey, but our works include letters to the editor, they include crafts, knitting, paper cutting, they include nature photography. One of our participants actually makes works out of leaves. And so to have a forum that would hold all of these different expressions of our experience, but also of our inspirations, seemed really suited. But I would say one of the big differences is that despite being narrated by women, the original Decameron is not exactly feminist. And I think that was a much a larger part of our mission to really create a space for women.
Mm-hmm. I'd say too, one of the interesting things for me is because we met regularly over Zoom, while we did have a time each week where we went and some of us wrote and some of us made film and some of us did other things, there's a huge component of oral storytelling on Zoom that I think really appealed to me. So the movement from Zoom as only a meeting place to actually being a creative place of oral storytelling. And I think we told each other a lot of stories that are kind of the haunting of some of the work that will eventually be published. There's a lot of things that are not captured that we told each other that seemed very, very much in the spirit of the initial frame narrative.
That's very interesting. I was actually wondering about just kind of the digitality of it all. So meeting on Zoom every week, would you say what would you say has come of this marriage of disembodiedness and presence, and how has that affected the creative work and the processes apart from the oral kind of storytelling within Zoom? Has it affected it in any other way?
Who wants to jump there?
Well, I'll offer one little thing. So at various times, we've also just kind of hit record. So we actually are able to capture what's happened in the room. So I think sometimes I've even treated it as if it's like an extension or like a living room we're all hanging out in, or we're all having cocktails. But I also think being able to capture those moments digitally was certainly part of, part of what happened. But we'll see what others add.
I'd say it really pushed the envelope for me in terms of thinking of myself creatively and thinking of the medium or the platform through which I was starting to make, because it became, similarly to teaching online, easier for me to share certain resources as opposed to sitting around in a cafe and saying, oh, well, I'll show you on my phone or whatever, or trying to draw it out or speak it out verbally. I could start to, let's say, actually, Isabella had mentioned this at some point, start to play with some AI, start to play with some software and just say, these are some other things I'm creating. And I'd never thought of myself as necessarily an artist in this variety, or maybe the scale of, and scope of various tools and platforms. It was great to do that, but also to share it and also to encourage others to say, hey, you should try out this weird AI or this weird tool.
We're all in our own spaces, and I think that actually matters, because if you're in a writers group that's meeting in a house somewhere, somebody says, okay, everybody write for 15 minutes, and everybody sits down and writes for 15 minutes. And we did the same thing on Zoom, like everybody write for 15 minutes. And then I would be like, I don't want to write, I want to improvise a song on the piano. And then I would record myself. I can't do that in a writers group. Right? The possibilities kind of open up when we're all in our own spaces, surrounded by the things that we can access. We can access anything we want. So if somebody wanted to do crafts, they can do crafts. If somebody wants to play a song, they can do that. So that was cool.
Yeah. And like everywhere else in the world, it's all quarantine inflected. So we are half the time like all in our pajamas. I don't know if people were just like lying down depressed on the floor half the time. I mean, you can't see once you turn off the video to begin the writing. So I really kind of like that as well, that it was sort of both sort of this quasi-public meeting for this creative work, but at the same time, never outside of the rootedness of what it means to be sort of quarantined and in this moment.
There's another thing about Zoom that I found really interesting, and that's the chat. So there's been, in addition to our face-to-face meeting and our screens off, your writing time, just a sort of steady exchange that's going on in the chat. So we share poems and photos and links to software. So that to me seems to be of a different piece, but the knowledge, the sort of tangential and peripheral knowledge sharing has been part of it. Because we're academics and creative writers at the same time, and people with lives.
I think that that's actually a really important point, that the idea that we're people with lives, and I think there's a tendency to think of using a technology like Zoom or another type of distance technology that it's somehow by default somehow alienating because we're not all together. And I think what I found was that it created a very intimate space that allowed us to actually feel very close to each other. And maybe that was because of the organic nature of it. I mean, sometimes we had kids and pets and things, outside noises intruding on our meetings, and that sort of feeling, I think made the Zoom space very intimate in that regard. So we really sort of got to know each other in our own spaces. We took each other on house tours. We looked in people's closets. So we did all kinds of kooky things like that. And that was, I think, sort of part of the whole creative experience, and also creating a space that felt intimate and was in that regard, that we weren't just sort of talking heads on a computer screen.
I mean, for me, what's been also nice is, the capacity to be able to not be limited by physical distance, and also save time on commuting to some cafe or elsewhere. It's true, I would just put on my pajama top, switch that, and I was ready. I wouldn't have to worry about, okay, I have to, get myself together and go somewhere. So it was quite nice for that. But especially because when I'm thinking about physical distance, half of the members, I mean, even here, live in the same city. So it would be very difficult for us, or for simply like-minded people, to have the opportunity to weekly, meet. So I know there's been a lot of discussion about the, feelings of disembodiment of through virtual presence, although one is never disembodied by technology. It's a nice way to think about it. You cannot escape that. But I do think one thing that this brought out is actually, stronger communities of like-minded people. Mm-hmm. That's at least something that I've been able to find. Yeah.
I also like, in terms of digital storytelling, any form that lets you, or that encourages you to write weekly. And in some ways, every week was distinct, but there's also, because of the overarching frame, I really felt that we were cumulatively creating sort of like a lot of work. And I think of like other kinds of, like email e-literature, or anything where you're constantly sending stuff out, and it lands sort of in its cumulative dimension. So it's kind of cool. After like the first year, I was like, wow, we're creating a lot of routine work. There's kind of what the technology is enabled to is kind of like a regularization of output. And, I started to think about potential readers and interlocutors to the work differently too, after we hit the year mark.
Oh, yeah, I think what Jolene mentioned just earlier about that increased intimacy within this digital space, of whether like sharing your home, sharing your pets, like all these tours, despite this lack of physical closeness. So you gain intimacy in like another respect that you lack, whereas if you met in person. I'm curious, has everyone here like met each other in person before, or like certain, I guess not. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I guess we'll kind of elaborate on this maybe in a later question, but I'm curious as to like how the structure, whether you guys are interested in staying in the Zoom digital structure later on, or maybe ever meeting in person and what that's going to be like, and whether that's going to shake up the relationship there. This is kind of a side question just to give a little bit more context for our viewers, perhaps. So you guys mentioned in the very beginning, the collective initially came together in hopes of actually reading the original Decameron, and then eventually that evolved to creating. And so I'm curious as to like what the schedule was like, this weekly schedule. Yeah, if you could tell me a little bit more about that creation process on this routine. Yeah.
Well, it's super simple. We meet usually Fridays after work, and we yak a bit. Then we turn off the screen and give ourselves a spell of time to write. And then we meet again and we read our works to each other. And it seems to be a very organic rhythm, but it works really well.
We show or we play. And to add to your question, if we do ever meet, there will be ball gowns involved, I think.
Well, I'll have to shower before we meet too.
Or sometimes we get distracted and then we talk about eyeballs. Like we had this one meeting where we just told horrible stories about people's eyes being destroyed. I don't know why.
It was a perfect kind of digital moment had we recorded all of that, because it was like handing the baton. It was really like, being around the fire. Every single person had a horrible eye disaster story. And I bet everybody listening to this also can imagine a horrible eye disaster story. So if you ever, yeah, it was good. But that's where I think too, that there are a lot of the things that happened are, oral storytelling that might not be captured in whatever ends up being the final product for this collective.
Right. And so recording the meetings that you have together would really capture these like little moments of just living through the pandemic together as well. So in these, I guess, weekly sessions, would everyone work on something that's different, or like kind of continue what they worked on last time? Or I guess there's really no structure, or is there a structure to that?
We often did have a structure. We often would have a theme or something that we would toss out, and then routinely people would move outside of that, which is great. But we often did have a structure to help to guide us. And that also comes from the Decameron. The idea of that there's sort of like something that would be a prompt that would start things off.
Yeah, that's actually maybe something to, I don't know if this is actually relevant to a later question. So stop me if it is, but I think it started with we'd wanted to do a version of a Secret Santa where we sent each other prompts, and that started to change the ways in which we created and thought about creation, because there were constraints. And so I'd get something from Kari that would say, and I didn't know who it was from, but it would say, you're not allowed to use words or something like that. You thought you would get to write. Nope. So that would encourage me and also challenge me. And those prompts started to be really fun. Better than sitting and being like, what do I hate most about my day? I'm going to write about that. I liked to start to think outside the box when someone else was saying even keywords. I don't know, tree, witch, forest, go.
I think at the beginning we wrote more about the plague, about COVID, and then as time went on, we started not doing that as much, expanding, telling stories that were more about other things, more like Boccaccio.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess I seem to be the strange member of this collective, because I've been mostly making films, and also I think I've written only 2 texts, and the rest of the things have been rethinking and reworking existing recipes, anti-plague recipes. So using recipes from other pandemics. And so it's been, so in some ways, I guess, on one hand, I appreciated the prompts, but I always have difficulty with following direction. So this was my way for it to be still related, but taking, I guess, the project in different directions and different narratives, if you will.
That's
Okay, so
also one of the things that was really very rich and also perfect for the digital is that it was able to, and we kind of talked about this earlier, but everybody's work could be shown then. You know, it's inherently multimodal, but it was super easy to see people's visual art as well as moving image. And even like the glitchiness, like sometimes, you know, when you obviously when you're sharing film over Zoom, it looks great on the person who's sending it, and it kind of can be really stuttering. And so, you know, I think we got a bit of glitch art in there too.
okay, that's great. So it sounds like you kind of started with something that had a structure, but then you were okay with it developing more organically. So this is kind of a related question in terms of structure, I guess, but the formation of the collective, or like Decameron 2.0. So Boccaccio's Decameron consisted of 10 members who passed time during the plague by telling like stories. And if I understand it correctly, they each had a day. So it was over the course of 10 days. We were wondering how you determined who would be a part of Decameron 2.0. So did you have like a vision for it going into it? And like, is there any significance with the number? There are 9 of you, 7 here today, but does the number hold any sort of significance to the structure?
It was good fortune. But we were actually, I don't think we even did a count until very recently when we were trying to sign digital spaces to design, and we realized we did not have 10 people. So we really were just open to people who were interested in joining us. But the larger number and people who've come and gone at different moments in their lives when they had more or less time has meant that there's always enough energy, you know, the more the merrier.
And always room for one more. I mean, I always kind of did think like 10 is kind of a good size for something, and but it wasn't stressful to have to go out and find a 10th member. I always so I think there's room to have 10 though.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, at the same time, nine is a beautiful number. You have 3 trios. And so, you know, also the 9 speaks to the COVID-19. I think that there are, we can think of various connections as well, but yeah.
So, oh, sorry, Monique, did you want to speak?
Well, in the digital space we're going to be designing, we've been talking about the 10th space that doesn't have a curator being the space of missing people, and so that does correspond quite nicely with the overarching themes of both survival and what is the reality of the pandemic, that a lot of people's loved ones are not around.
Maybe we could speak to that because it's the first time in this interview that we've actually addressed that what the outcome is of those works. And so we're thinking, you know, the idea was, where does this work go? Who does it go to? What shape will it take? Shapes possibly. And to be fair about it, like we're still in the midst of talking about it, but one thing that we really do want to do is create a web-based or virtual interactive gallery or space, exploratory space, in which we can house all of our works collectively and have them be a new form of storytelling, a digital form of storytelling. And so we're imagining 10 other rooms or spaces in which the works get thematized according to work, thematized. And as mentioned, number 10 is a kind of memory space. I think it symbolizes everything that Monique had just said, but also for me, at least, especially because for me, I've written 2 obituaries that it was also a space of remembering people lost during the pandemic, either because of COVID-19 or that people, I mean, unfortunately, a lot of people have passed away in this time. And I think something that is shared is that a lot of the time I wasn't able to see those people, or the time I spent with them was cut off because I could not physically move places to see them in the end. So that 10th space, I mean, if there's a 10th kind of pillar, it's almost, I mean, I think chronology is the last, but for me, it's also the center.
It's this space too where even if you didn't personally lose somebody during the pandemic, but you know, there was a lot of loss nevertheless of all kinds of things and all kinds of ways of living, and there's just this heavy sense of loss, like we've really lost something, and that we have to think about how we're going to be moving forward after the pandemic is over, and what do we take with us from the pre-pandemic world into the post-pandemic world, and what do we leave behind? And I think moving through that, there is a process of mourning that we're all going to go through, whether it's the loss of a person or an idea or an ideal, or values, and just a way of living. So, you know, I think we're all in our own ways processing that loss. We're going through a period of mourning.
All right. So while the Black Plague influenced the Decameron 1.0, we were curious as to how specifically the COVID-19 pandemic informed and shaped your work this time around.
I think a lot of the works we've produced are very much about the culture of everyday life. And so, you know, a lot of them describe what it is to be in one's kitchen, what it is to not leave one's property. There's a lot of work around gardens and gardening. And so there's a log of everydayliness that is every day because the pandemic really put these constraints around our lives. There's probably less of an overt sort of meta reflection on what is out there. And so we haven't done a lot of work that you know, a virologist maybe would understand or appreciate. But it's always present. It's always at the borders of what we've produced.
There are quite a few works, though, that are in direct response to daily life in the context of COVID-19. And, you know, we've heard like there are some that are obituaries. I also thought it was really interesting that I think probably, at least because of the intertext of the Decameron, a lot of interest in sort of like looking back historically across plagues. So as Isabella mentioned, like, you know, really looking at like recipes of plague time, but there have also been a lot of focus on like spells. Angela has this incredible series of spells. Thinking of, yeah, I mean, there's sort of like that idea of like what happens when everyday life is shattered in particular ways and what kind of magic is possible in there. There have been a number of, yeah, there are obituaries, there are sad stories. So I think some of them are actually in direct conversation with COVID-19, and some of them are in direct conversation, I think, with just over history, what it means to have your life upended in particular ways, and examinations of solitariness. And I mean, I imagine there are a lot more themes, but those are the kind that sort of jump out at me.
And sometimes the upendedness of COVID has created new stuff. Like my response to COVID-19 was apparently to get a DSLR camera and learn to use it and then take pictures of every bird. Like I go out to the Don Valley every day and take pictures of every bird I can find. And that's what I do now. And I make stories in my head about these birds. I'm a fantasy author, so it just naturally happens. Like the killdeers are clearly wizards because they have red eyes, and the other birds are kind of scared of them. And the cardinals are always hiding their faces behind sticks because they're scared of the killdeer wizards. And every yellow warbler hates Greg. Who is Greg? I don't know. They just all hate Greg. So the stories kind of grew out of this weird new thing I was doing, and that I would never have done, ever have done if COVID hadn't happened. I would never have picked up a serious camera. And so
become a performance artist.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that even the works within the body that we've created that don't specifically address or mention you know, the pandemic in any way are driven by that pandemic. They wouldn't have come about if we hadn't created this space and if we hadn't been thinking of ways in which to cope and understand what's happening and understand this moment in history and somehow make some sort of impact because of it. So, you know, like, how do you go through something like a pandemic and not make some kind of grand gesture, I guess, in the sort of historical tradition of grand gestures. This is our grand gesture of what it was to live through this pandemic, even if we're not specifically talking about it.
Yeah. I like that. And I like also the contrast between the idea of the grand gesture and just these as documents of dailiness during a very, very odd time. And I think both those polls. And I'd say too, just also coming back to the Decameron, like being able to use the framing structure feels really brilliant now. Like it really does feel coming full circle around what we might have been able to take from Decameron, and the way in which you can have so many different kinds of texts and voices and practices, and somehow they all make sense. And I think that, we're in that moment again now where like we've done such a range, digital, analog, different kinds of practices, fiction, poetry, obituaries, these spells, and being able to structure them into these 10 spaces all of a sudden gives it sort of a narrative backbone where these, I hope, will be intelligible to people and will be able to exist in the same universe and be and make sense and land creatively.
The series of films that I made actually use images of present images of COVID, and some of it includes virus itself, and others of just people around the world. But because I'm using an AI program, it processes these images. And surprisingly, one of the common themes that I've been seeing, or an image that emerge, are birds. So I don't know. There must be something with birds and COVID, because it seems to be an ongoing kind of fascination. And I guess for me, it also started with the mask of the doctor during the Black Plague. And so maybe that has kind of permeated our, I don't know, our psyche, so we associate that. But it's such a strong image, and has been so visible at the beginning of the pandemic. So maybe that's why I'm seeing everything turning into birds in the videos that I'm making.
That's interesting. I feel like maybe the kind of growing obsession with birds might have something to do with like with the Decameron 2.0 too. It's through the creative works, there's a lot of reflection going on, right? So I would imagine maybe just in terms of like this, like the symbolic aspect of like birds and like freedom, right? Where especially with like the multiple lockdowns that we've had globally, and like feeling trapped and not being able to experience that freedom to do just like the everyday things that we're used to do. Yeah, I can see how that resonates with a lot of people. Also with what you said about the Decameron 2.0 and the projects that come of it having to do with both everyday minute things as well as grand gestures about the pandemic. So one thing that we find interesting is that the Decameron 2.0, the project is going to be published kind of, hopefully, I want to say at the tail end of the pandemic, right? We've been through it for over a year now, fingers crossed. So what do you hope will become of this project, and what do you want people to take away from it now that we're kind of getting to the end of the pandemic?
Well, one of the so the project, and I'll let other people talk about it as well. We've always talked about having it live in different locations. So one of the possible versions of it is very analog, and we've been talking about boxes in the spirit of Aspen magazine, the Fluxus magazine from the 1970s, where there were records and there were recipes and all sorts of architectural blueprints and so on. So there's this idea that we still intend to follow up on, where there will be a kind of object that is a gift, and we want to put some of those in archives and keep some of them in our own shelves. But then the digital version, we always talked about it as rooms. So whether it's an immersive space or a web space, and the Decameron builds on an ancient, the original Decameron, an ancient idea of the pleasant place, the locus amoenus. And so these rooms that we want to design are really places that are kind of the anti-pandemic space. We will invite people to be with us and with the works that we've produced, and sort of inhabit it. And that I think is part of this larger, hope that we have for the future, where people can come together, strangers included.
Yeah, I love that, especially just like going back to the whole how you're gathering together on Zoom weekly. It's like the Zoom room is developing these other kind of spaces.
That never even occurred to us, but yes, that's great.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think for myself, what I'm hoping is that people can come into these spaces or interact with our work in whichever form they happen to encounter, and that having come, the pandemic is something that everyone has experienced in the entire world. It's the common thread that we can truly say has been a global experience. And what I'm hoping is that when people interact with our work and in the spaces that we create, that they have an opportunity to reflect on that experience and also maybe find some joy from that time period, that there has been something positive that can come out of an experience like this, despite the loss, despite, and that's not to dismiss those things, but to say that our lives weren't on hold for that time period. Life continued, and things continue to happen, and that time is still meaningful. So while we may feel like our lives are on hold for that time period because we were in isolation and we couldn't do the things we normally do, we were still living our life, and that we have to find some kind of joy from that time period. We have to remember this time somehow as not just being on hold, and that perhaps there's some joy that can be found in that time period that we can take with us into our memories in the future of this time.
Absolutely. Yeah. I also think that the opportunity to sort of create work, like to actually imagine an audience for this work, is also an opportunity for us to engage in sort of another activity of research creation, and going back and having a sense of, like, over the course of a year and a half, finding the works, re-engaging with them, finding the patterns, finding the birds, finding the plague masks, but also finding being able to sort of flip that question back to ourselves around what we hope, what did we make, what did this enable us to think. And I'm sort of my general sense is that personally, this is a way I really like to work, to find out what meaning might there be in these texts and in the exercise in which we've engaged, that we might be able to find that out through this final making.
Yeah, for sure. I think those are some really great points as to just reflecting on this time and just the work that you've all made together. So while we look in reflection of the work that we made, we're also curious as to what shape or direction do you see this project taking on in the future? And what do you think will become of this collective as the pandemic now comes to a close?
Well, my hope is that we never stop. It's just been so transformative for every part of my life, personal and intellectual and creative. And there's there's something to be said about moving from, we're all academics, from a universe in which we really are kind of solipsistic and we write for ourselves or for strangers, and we are all a bit neurotic about it, to understanding that there are these audiences, first each other, and then people who might actually be interested in what we say because it's full of life and it's full of care. And so that for me has been just the biggest gift of it all. Knowing that there are people and people who listen, and that creates space that we all need, I think.
Yes, I hope there'll still be more writing and more cocktails.
Yes.
And I would say too, it's been actually like such a pleasure to meet. There are a couple of people who I knew sort of, I know some people well, some just from online and some totally new to me. And it's been really fantastic thinking of people from different parts of the country, different parts of the province, different places in the academic system. I think we often fail at creating spaces where we can both be mentored and mentor people and exist in community across academic, departments, across academic rank. And I think it's kind of like a cool feminist moment.
Yeah, for sure. So from what I understand, the Decameron 2.0 identifies itself as a feminist media collective. So what does that mean for all of you here?
People will have different interpretations than us. Even people here might have different interpretations than me, but I think a lot of it is about precisely community, not being and rather than think about dynamics of power, thinking about dynamics of exchange, altruism, but through tools. So actually, this is interesting because like this is how I originally got into the field of electronic literature, because to me it seemed very feminist. If it's these a group of, not all of them, but many women who may have just had decided, I'm not interested in the traditional publishing avenue and all of the gatekeeping that may happen and the exclusivity, and had thought about unique, emerging, accessible, low cost tools, add on adjectives as you please, and use that as the means to vocalize, to have a voice. So I think the additional 2.0 here also signifies what this continues to look like if those tools continue to be the means through which we make. And so I've always been inspired by a lot of those women and the ways in which they were like, if you won't let me, I'll find another way. I don't need your money. It's very actually Virginia Woolf, if you think about it. It's like I wrote about I had wrote a talk about this once called like an electronic room of one's own, which is along those lines, like what tools do I have that allow me to connect, to create, to vocalize, to have a platform. And here I'm using the term platform doubly, right? So the platform of the tool, the platform to leverage and raise myself and others. So that's my interpretation.
It's also about creating a space where people feel safe to create and to experiment and do things that they may not necessarily feel comfortable explaining to the general public or even their close friends, but for whatever reason it felt comfortable. We created this zone where this is specifically a creative space, and whatever idea you had, whatever kooky idea you decided to bring to this space, everybody had something supportive to say, or an idea of, have you tried this, and what about doing this, and so it didn't really even feel weird when you'd come to the space and say, so I'm printing things on tea bags, and people were like, oh cool, let's see it, and it's just this space where anything goes, and it was okay, and if it didn't go, that's okay, you could start again. But I think that there was this feeling that we could bring these ideas and we could work through some of these problems and we could help each other out, and it was never, oh, that's a terrible idea. Like that never happened. Even if it was a terrible idea, I don't think anybody ever vocalized it. So it just wasn't anything goes kind of space.
I think also that kind of forum, I'd argue, there is something inherently feminist in it. When you start to say that you can already depart from particular kinds of narrative line, I mean, this is what I've always sort of loved about the electronic literature community anyway. But I think once you can say you're departing from particular forms, or that you're outside of forms, or that you're trying to find shapes that can sustain multivocal participation, if you're trying to find ways of relating and ways of making together that can coexist across difference, when you are trying to not sort of like smash everything into the same shape, but rather say, okay, well, we've got a room, but within that, we can create all sorts of shapes. So I think there's a really nice play between the affordances of electronic literature and about being able to create, even with the open questions of whether these will finally find some kind of place together in an immersive environment, or whether they're going to be web-based, or whether these are all kind of they're forms that hold open possibilities and contradictions. and I like the messiness of that. And I think that there's something inherently feminist in that kind of media making.
And also, no, sorry.
Go ahead.
All right, I was just going to say we could complain about stuff without feeling bad about it, or as if we were imposing on people with our terrible lady complaints. We could just be sad if we wanted to be sad, or say that the world was dumb and we didn't like it if we wanted to do that. Or complain.
We're also consciousness of grazing group 2.0. It's true. It was like right back to like 1971. We had like check-ins. And,
yeah. And I think that, you asked about what the digital space facilitates. Another big part of it is just listening, that textual spaces don't create that intimacy. And there's something about having people sort of pause and turn on their ears that's very feminist as well. And so, it extended from listening to the poems to listening to the, complaints about the day. But being there with your ears is a really important part of a feminist praxis.
Well, one thing I should mention that hasn't really been mentioned, that one thing that COVID-19 afforded is the digitization of so many archival collections. And I dove into those collections. And so one aspect of, I would say, for me, at least as a feminist practice, is also looking and retrieving the forgotten women. So for me, this has been, I am looking at recipes of pandemics, and coincidentally, those recipes are written in the same recipe books as food. And women were usually the ones creating these, as opposed to, scientists who are mainly known as men, right? So it's interesting to look at that, but also this also compelled me to look even deeper and into medieval studies and look more at the image and text relationship, and then also look at recent scholarship on of feminism during the Middle Ages, about which not many are, that well aware. So I guess I'm always interested in kind of bringing back the forgotten, and especially the women that that one always wants to look up to or have been written out. So this has been a great opportunity to do that during the pandemic. But I would say that it's this collective that's inspired me to do that. The creativity and the brilliance of these women just made me think, wait a minute, I'm going to be looking, when I'm examining all these images, I'm going to be looking for representations of women and seeing, who were the illuminators, right? Many of them were women. They weren't only monks. Nuns were doing the same thing. So I don't know. So this is, I guess, my kind of side, or that's kind of how I interpret the feminist, at least how it is present in my practice.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point that you bring up. So apart from the Decameron 2.0 coming out of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic itself, I think one thing that COVID-19 has illuminated is just the amount of invisible labor on the part of women. So, with work from home and stuff, and having childcare not available, and like with women having to take care of their families, even though society is a lot more progressive now, we still kind of fall back into those gendered roles. So I think, yeah, looking into kind of the work that women have done and where that's been erased or hidden, I think that's very timely and relevant to this. I kind of wanted to bring it back real quick to, I think Caitlin mentioned affordances, and just looking at more broadly, like the digital medium of Decameron 2.0, and how it lends itself to connectivity across the globe. You've already mentioned that the pandemic has been a shared experience globally, but as we know, the experiences are still while it's universal, it's different depending on what country you're in, where you are across the globe. So I was just wondering about what you're anticipating in terms of the reception of this publication. So that can either pertain like to a global audience, or earlier you mentioned something about scholarship and like academia. So what do you think will happen in terms of a global reception or a reception by the general public for this project?
I don't know. I'm curious to see. I think it's very different. And I don't have a full answer. It's an interesting question. I think it's very different when you start a kind of project and you know who your audience is, and you know you're writing for publication, and you know you're pitching it a particular way. I think that's a very, very different process than the process with which we were involved, where we're kind of immersed in a moment, responding to it creatively, and as a secondary byproduct, thinking, possibly this is something that we will put out as a document in the world. I would, like, I'm thinking it's a very small piece of the world that exists as one document that will be, reproduced in so many different places, in so many different ways. I see us as being like a tiny, tiny part of that. At the same time, I'm super curious. It emerges from what I think has been a very, very interesting process. And I've really liked that it hasn't been at the forefront of my mind, at least for most of our time together, thinking, oh, where will this be published? Oh, who will be interested in this? Because it was actually both writing as a kind of as a life-saving thing for ourselves and our own sanity, and also sharing here first. So I don't know what other people sort of think. I'm not, I have no crystal ball to see where this will land.
So I want to pick up on something that Caitlin kind of touched on, and that, although she didn't use the word, it was very personal. I think that a lot of the creations that we made were started with a very personal idea, or came from a very personal space. And I think that will make it important in terms of when you talk about the global experience of the pandemic and how different those experiences can be, even though we all experienced the same pandemic. We didn't. And of course, that cuts across all kinds of different lines of socioeconomic, cultural, ethnic class, everything. And I think the problem with trying to set out to talk about the pandemic sort of universally is that inevitably somebody's going to be left out. And I think when we're starting from a personal space, we don't have to worry about that as much, because we're not trying to say this is the universal experience of the pandemic. This was our personal experience, and we want to share it with you. And you can take it or you can leave it. You can relate to it, or you might not relate to it, and that's okay. And so I think that where that might make out what we're doing a little bit more accessible too, because we're not trying to universalize that experience and trying to say this was the pandemic. No, this was our pandemic. This was, something that we're inviting you into our space to, to share that with you, and to allow that exchange to take place.
Cool. Yeah, so I guess we're reaching the end of this interview. So as for our last question, we wanted to ask if there's anything else you'd like to add or share that we haven't really touched upon.
Do we want to talk about methodology or mentorship, friendship? I don't know. I'm thinking of other themes that have come up over the last 18 months.
Sure, yeah. What are some takeaways methodologically?
Well, I don't know. Sorry, I was just going to say, I don't know if there are strict rules. So like the methodology question we can definitely address, but I also wanted to say, I'm just thinking about the fact that the process couldn't be regulated. I apologize for throwing out a question and being like, actually, because sometimes, because it was a pandemic, sometimes it was exhausting, or not this, but the pandemic itself was exhausting. So I think we could also see the changes in our work and inspiration through the time. And then what's interesting is, like, with the final work, I don't believe we intend to present it chronologically, but that might be nice, just to show the unpredictability of the day, of the dailiness. And apologies, Monique, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I think, you know, we have different ways of thinking about this work depending on which hats we're wearing, really. But one of the big takeaways I would want people to have is just about, you know, community practice as a way of seeing and a way of being, and as a way of opening up some doors into things that might not have been observable before. You know, I really think that it has tuned us, and hopefully some other people as well, to both inside things and outside things, and big things and little things, and political things and personal things. So it's an optic that I think carries into scholarly and creative domains. But you know, the Edna test, like, I always wonder what would happen if you know, if somebody who doesn't, you know, play with digital text, and somebody who doesn't read a lot, who can they come in and find something in the work that we've produced? And I think that's the test, right? That there's sort of something about an orientation that will hopefully leave a little bit of a sweet spot in some people's lives.
I think I'll add too that part of the reason, if people are like listening to this and wondering whether they should maybe like engage with the work, it's not just that, you know, we like each other, we've got this way of working that I've really valued. I think there's some really fine writing and some amazing art. So I would also, yeah, I wouldn't want the interview to end without saying, like, it's partly absolutely about the process. It's about finding form. It's about creating community. There are all these cool things that have happened. It's about being in conversation with the moment. It's about leaving some kind of trace of this time. But I think there's also some really fine writing and some really beautiful art. So I hope people engage with it on that level too.
Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry. I would just add, you know, in terms of the quality of the work, it's really interesting to see how the threads connect things to one another. So that there are these themes that move between, you know, these incredible films and these incredible tea bags is just really interesting. Kari, sorry.
I was just doing the comedy Kari thing and saying, and also lots of birds. That's all. Birds everywhere.
Definitely lots of birds.
Pooping birds. Yeah.
Okay, well, you shared with us that normally you meet for your weekly writing sessions Friday after work. So I'm guessing that that's the time you shared with us today. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk about your motivations and the inspirations behind Decameron 2.0. It's really encouraging to see that despite how awful the COVID-19 pandemic has been, there have been some good things like this collective and this work that's come of it as well. So we really look forward to seeing it launch in September, along with the other projects in the special issue of TDR and EBR. And thanks again for doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lulu and Jinsel, for interviewing us today, and for your thoughtful questions, and for allowing us to kind of think aloud and have a conversation.
You're welcome. It was a lot of fun.
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you for sharing this time with us.